Okay, so there was a new study that recently just came out that made it seemed to kind of prove that there is a psychological connection between the ultra woke left, we'll call it, and the alt right, and that connection they called it the dark triad. And I'm told that is not a Star Wars sequel or prequel, that it's an actual thing. And since you're the one who actually read the study, whereas I read about the study, maybe I'll have you kind of explain what the study actually said.
Yeah, so basically, this was a study out of Australia, an Australian journal. There were a couple of psychologists basically who were interested in looking at some of the new culture that had emerged around universities, but also going beyond universities. I think universities are what got them interested in it. Basically, what they did is they used an earlier survey which sought to segment out people who have politically correct attitudes on two different spectrums. So there's one that's called politically correct liberalism, which is like basically the like concern for minorities, concern to causing offense, so on and so forth. There's another spectrum called political correctness, like associated with authoritarianism, which was like usually some kind of an administration of punishment, some kind of deterrence. So, for instance, like when they ask people on surveys, like, do you think that a professor who like says something offensive should be punished, should be dismissed from their job, so on and so forth. So that's kind of how they construct that attitude with their surveys. What they did is they interviewed a bunch of American participants, kind of rated them on those attitudes, and then they also took some people from the far right, people who have kind of like white identitarian type beliefs, meaning believing that whites are like under attack, kind of belief towards a white ethno state, or at least there should be like a white identity that you're protecting, defensively protecting. And what they did is they gave both those groups of people, kind of the people with the politically correct kind of authoritarian beliefs and the kind of the alt right type, far right type beliefs. They gave them basically questionnaires and surveys related to personality. And what they did is they wanted to see what personality attributes are kind of correlated with holding those political attitudes. And what was really interesting is that the people who had the kind of the PCA, politically correct authoritarian attitudes, or we can call them woke attitudes, they tended to have a lot of the same personality characteristics as people who had the alt right or far right kind of attitudes. So there were three in particular that correlate very strongly, and they're in psychology they're called the dark triad traits because when you have all three of them, it tends to result in like very toxic personalities, like people who are very controlling, who generally have very little tolerance for disagreement, who generally have a kind of predisposition to being maybe in an abusive relationship or something we would associate that with. So the three personality attributes are one like Machiavellianism, second is narcissism, and then the third is psychopathy. So those three together are considered dark triad. And what they found is that there's a very strong relationship between having those three personality traits and having these political attitudes on the far right and kind of woke left. What was interesting is that they didn't find any kind of relationship between like normal like liberal kind of attitudes, like politically correct attitudes. So like if you just believe that like we generally shouldn't try to offend people, or you don't believe in like biological racism, this study isn't really about you because they didn't really find that relationship. The relationship was really only found between people who kind of want to control other people's behavior or seek to have some kind of punishment or administration of these beliefs in different contexts, whether it's like a university context or what's happening in society. Another question I think that was used to separate out the attitudes was asking about like should somebody accused of like sexual misconduct at the university have to prove their innocence, like the onus is on them, right? Like if you're someone who tends to believe that, you tend to be more on the kind of the woke authoritarian side versus being maybe in the more standard liberal position or normal or kind of moderate position. So the study was interesting to me because I think that a lot of the woke attitudes seem to be associated with what I generally thought of as like very conservative ways of looking at the world. Like, I think about people I knew who, as kids, they weren't allowed to read Harry Potter, right? Like, because their parents were very devout Christians and they thought Harry Potter was corrupting. So they would just say, you're not allowed to read that in this house. Whereas I think more liberal-leaning parents generally, I would think, were more permissive. So like that's how we typically measure authoritarianism in like political science surveys, is that they ask people basically questions about child rearing, like how permissive they are with other people. And generally speaking, more right-wing people are more authoritarian on that scale. More left-wing people are less authoritarian on that scale. And I'd wondered for a long time, like, is wokeness and this idea that like we have to wage perpetual culture war, we have to be able to use punitive or we have to use punitive or authoritarian measures to enforce that cultural war. We have to kind of control what people read, see, think, hear. Is that developing a more authoritarian bent? And I think that this study kind of demonstrates that there is that strain of personality characteristics in part of the left too now, whereas typically we've seen these things as on the opposite side of the spectrum.
Is this the same study that found a link regarding just use of victimhood and victimization?
I don't think that this was a study. I think there have been some related studies that have looked at like the classifications of people who demonstrate victimhood. I don't think this one in particular was looking at that in particular.
Oh, okay. Because I seem to recall a recent study in the past few days reading about it, also finding a similar link between both the left and the right in terms of these same psychological traits, leading people to be more likely to also use victimhood and sort of a victimization narrative in order to kind of promote themselves and like sort of like their political priorities, which is also kind of interesting because if you think about it, on both sides there's a victimization narrative there, right? On both the woke left and also on the alt right. I mean, I think nowadays it's very common for people to kind of claim that victimization and victimhood is sort of an overused thing on the left, and that's all people talk about. But that's also on the right too, has been for a long time, and especially with the alt right, this idea that it's a specifically white identity that's being sort of victimized in society. And those I seem to recall it's those same kind of dark triad traits that lend themselves to the use of victimhood. Specifically narcissism is what I read. And the reason for that is that it's sort of a Machiavellian attempt at sort of extracting more resources out of a political system or a society, because they know that especially in like Western egalitarian societies, we, I think, very rightly treat victimhood as something to pay attention to, right? I mean, Western egalitarian societies tend to want to minimize unequal outcomes, right? Because when we see unequal outcomes, it at least sort of raises a flag that maybe there is something wrong going on here and we should investigate that. And that's actually a good thing, I think, right?
Yeah. I was just looking this up as you were talking because I think I recall this as well. This was a separate study published by some Canadian researchers, and the title of this study is "Signaling Virtuous Victimhood as Indicators of Dark Triad Personalities." So that's the study that Shant is talking about.
Okay, so it is that's the triad as well. So
yeah, they were both triad, although this one that I just referenced, it's tying it more to political attitudes, like how much do you think we need to punish like people who are politically incorrect or transgressors, and tying that with like people who are white identitarians or white nationalists tend to have the same kind of personality traits. This study, I think, Shant, is more about looking specifically at people who engage in what the researchers call virtuous victim signaling, which is like demonstrating in some way that you are a victim or making the claim that you are a victim in some way. And it seemed like this one found a link to the same behaviors. And it's interesting that not only is not the same behaviors, the same personality traits, but they also looked at behaviors because they found that if you have this frequency of like emitting these virtuous victim signaling, like if you're doing that a lot, it also is linked to like someone's willingness to engage in behaviors that we generally find like ethically questionable, like lying to earn a bonus, right? Or doing or like engaging in like counterfeiting. Like these are things that could get you ahead. Like it could be, you could even consider that to be part of like Machiavellianism. But they aren't things that we would associate with like a legitimate victim. Like if somebody has been wronged, we think, well, that person needs to be repaired in some way. They were looking at this claim of victimhood almost like it was being weaponized. And if you have these personality traits, especially like if you're a Machiavellian personality, if you're a narcissist, you're more likely to use that. And someone who comes to mind when I'm thinking about this, we always think about this talking about the political left. But I think the most powerful proponent of this right now is like the president of the United States. Like Trump is constantly claiming he's a victim of this or victim of that, like nonstop. I don't think he can go more than a week without making some kind of claim of persecution by somebody or something. And it's an odd thing to see for someone who's president of the United States. It's a fairly powerful position. Even if you are a victim of various things, you've still elevated yourself to like the highest governing position in the United States. I guess the Supreme Court could be considered higher in some ways, but pretty much it's pretty up there. President is pretty. I think most people would say if you're president, you're pretty lucky. And he engages in it constantly. And I think that people associate these personality qualities with him, particularly narcissism, right? Because like some people think narcissism means like you have a really like big ego, and it kind of does, but really it means you have a fragile ego, right? Like it means that you're like really insecure. And I think that that's something that he seems to demonstrate a lot, and that's why he engages in like the frequent victimization.
Yeah, Trump's his like one of his most frequent put downs for someone doesn't even sound like a put down at all, but it's always he or she treated me very, very badly. Very, very badly. This person treated me very, very badly, right? And so it's always this attempt to sort of curry favor and sort of sympathy for him. And it's yeah, I mean he's clearly engaging in what we're talking about here. But yeah, it's interesting because there's a pretty clear like political it translates to politics really obviously what they're talking about here, right? Because that's a very classic kind of way of trying to center yourself within a political narrative, right? Is to make yourself a victim. And the thing is, that gets a lot of backlash these days. It's often used as a put down or a pejorative to say that you're trying to be a victim and whatnot. But I mean, the truth is it's trying to use a very natural impulse that's probably healthy, right? It's probably healthy that exists in society, in sort of free and egalitarian prioritizing societies, right? Because if someone is suffering, well, then that's a signal, right? That's a signal that, okay, well, maybe we need to repair something here. We need to fix something systemically or structurally, or at least on an individual level, right? And if there are unequal outcomes, then that at least deserves investigation. But there are people who obviously have certain personality traits that can kind of identify a weakness in the system or a loophole to try and sort of extract something that they don't necessarily deserve.
Hi everyone, it's Zed here. Thanks for watching. My friends Leighton and Shant and I launched the Back channel as a way to add a dose of reality to the insular online discourse that's shaping our politics right now. It's an experiment, and for it to continue, we could really use your support. We've launched a Patreon page at patreon.com/thebackchannel, where you can pledge a small amount to help the show expand and improve. Thanks so much for your support, and thanks for watching.